Hello everyone and welcome to the Entrepreneurial Edge, where we aim to have conversations that take aspiring entrepreneurs and give them the edge that they're looking for. I'm Varun Arora, co-president of the eCell here at Laksha University, and with us today we have Priyadarshan Mundhra, or popularly known as PD Mundhra, who is the co-founder and executive director of eClerx Services Limited, which is a business process outsourcing company which employs today over 18,000 people globally. It's a pleasure to have you, sir.
Thank you so much, Varun.
Right. So, I do have some questions prepared for you today, and based on your responses, we can then accordingly take the conversation forward.
Sounds great.
Yeah. So, first, I understand that you first did a BCom and then an MBA, got some industry experience, and then eventually started your own venture. So I'd love to know about, your early journey. What was your thought at that time? Did you always have entrepreneurship, as your goal?
I did. So when I finished my MBA, I came back to India. I was in the very small minority of students of Indian origin who chose to return. Most stayed back in the US at the time. I had deep roots in India, so I wanted to settle here, and also I wanted to be an entrepreneur and start my own business. Mm-hmm. The initial plan was to try and create something in financial services, which didn't really work out. Then I spent some time associated with Hindustan Lever, trying to set up a detergent packaging plant, which worked for a little bit of time before eventually starting eClerx. So I think it's also important to note that in the India of the mid-1990s, the corporate opportunities were nowhere near as attractive as they are today. Mm-hmm. So being an entrepreneur, I think the bar was much lower than perhaps it is today.
That's interesting. So would you say you might do things differently considering how the opportunities we have today in India are different?
Oh, of course. You have to adapt to the situation you find yourself in. Even with eClerx, I'd be the first to put my hand up and confess that we did not have a grand plan with, every milestone for the next 5 or 7 years laid out. A lot of the journey was about accidents of history and responding to situations and opportunities that emerged. So I think you have to be agile and be aware of what's happening around you and respond to that.
Right. I think we all need to do that, be aware. So your co-founder Anjan, you decided to work with him after you spent some time in industry while he was still at Lehman Brothers. However, you did know him from your time at Wharton. So did you notice or observe something in him that made you decide, I'm definitely going to work with him later on?
Yes. So we were part of a larger group of students at Wharton that were instrumental in setting up the Wharton India Economic Forum, which is basically an India conference hosted by students at Wharton. And my partner Anjan was the driving force behind securing corporate sponsorship for that event. And to me, that was quite an outstanding achievement, and I felt that he really had the ability of marketing and selling in a much more effective fashion than most other people that I knew. So that was very attractive to me in terms of being a business partner. And we also had a very good equation working with each other. We were good friends. So I think that made that decision much easier.
Got it. So did you say, you had some skills that he didn't? What advice would you give to maybe college students in finding their co-founder?
I would say it always helps in finding complementary skills. So I would say my mindset was much more around creating processes and sort of, structure and execution. And Anjan was much more the client-facing marketing and sales personality of the firm. So in that sense, I think we had two separate personalities. It also helped that I was based in India, where the services were delivered from, and he was based in New York and London, where clients were. So that geographical spread, we could also straddle. And finally, I would say chemistry, because both of us are, I would like to think, fairly objective and data-driven people. So it is inevitable in any journey, especially of the length that we've had of 20 years, you will have differences of opinion. And then to the extent you can have a rational conversation with each other and try and arrive at a logical decision that is best for the firm, it's helpful. If you're very emotional people, or you can't resolve those conflicts, then it's a very short-lived partnership. So I'd say there were three things that sort of made that partnership work.
Right. It's really interesting to note how the geography and the sales, and him doing sales versus you doing your processes, that really worked out well. So one more thing was that Dell was your first marquee client. So how did you go about achieving them as your first big name client? And also for those building in B2B, it's very tricky to get that first client. So what advice would you give to them?
Absolutely. I think securing the first client is a big hurdle and an important one. In our case, what helped was that we'd been doing similar work as what Dell was looking to get for other smaller clients. So we had some relevant experience that we could show to them. We got a foot in the door because another business school friend of ours was working at Dell at the time. So he made us aware that there is a need for this kind of work and support that Dell was looking out for. And then we went and made a pitch along with many other competitors, and sort of our pitch was focused around two broad messages. One is that we have relevant experience in exactly the kind of work that you want done. And secondly, we're a small firm, so for for us, you will be our single most important project. Whereas if you give it to a very large firm, then given this relatively small size of that work for the large firm, you won't get that kind of mind share. So the level of attention and focus that you'll get from us is very different. And we also offered to invest by doing a free pilot for them for about 3 months, saying we'll do this work for you for free. You see what we do and measure the results of what we've done. And if you think that they're good, then you sign up with us for the long term. So I think that combination of factors helped. We won the pilot. The pilot was a success. They signed on with us. In terms of your follow-up question about advice, I would say especially in a B2B business, relationships matter. And when you're a startup, I think your personal network and your personal credibility have a lot to do with securing that first client. And it's not unusual for companies to sign up with clients that have fairly deep connections to one of the founders initially, right?
Yeah.
And then once you get that first client, things become much easier. You get some momentum. It's like a snowball rolling downhill, right? So you can pick up more and more snow. But that first breaking that friction point is not easy.
Yeah, and it goes back to the very popular advice when you're just starting out, do things that don't scale. I think I saw that with your Dell journey you mentioned, because you gave them a free pilot, right? But when you're already a big firm, maybe you cannot do that at scale, right? And
sorry, since you asked, one more thought comes to mind, that we have an adage within the firm that it's very hard to sell new things to new clients, right? So at least on one of the axes, you need to have continuity. So either if you're trying to develop new capabilities, it's very likely the only people willing to take a punt and risk with you are people who are comfortable with you. And so they say, okay, you've done X, Y, Z for me, so I will try you for ABC. Or you have some well-defined capabilities, you've done X, Y, Z for 3 clients, then a new client will come and say, okay, you know what, you're proven in this space, I'll buy from you. But if you have a new situation, so you have new capability, new client, that's a tough one to solve.
That's a great way to think about it. So one thing you mentioned earlier today was that I think from 2016 to 2020, you mentioned revenue was like at a flat line. And then from 2020 to 2024, I actually noticed revenue doubled, already on a very big base. I think it was around 20,000 crores. So what were, some of the pivotal things that enabled you to do that?
So in a simple one phrase answer is the post-COVID bump. So, this is how life turns out in very unexpected fashion. When COVID happened and the lockdowns happened, everybody initially thought it's going to be very negative for the industry. But I think the Indian IT and ITES industry on the whole outperformed by how quickly they were able to pivot to work from home, provision all the necessary infrastructure in terms of connectivity, laptops, telecom infrastructure for all the employees to work securely from home. And the broadband, etc., proved to be very reliable. So I think our clients were also very positively surprised by how resilient India was as a geography compared to other places like the Philippines, for example. So I think in terms of relative performance, India as a geography, came out very well out of that COVID lockdown period. Secondly, clients also moved to a remote working environment. And then the thought process came that, look, first of all these jobs can be done remotely, which earlier they had not realized. And if it can be done remotely, why does it have to be done remotely in a high-cost geography? It can be done in a low-cost geography. So the addressable market for outsourced services suddenly increased substantially, because things that a client would never have considered offshoring or outsourcing earlier were now on the table for discussion. So you would have seen all IT and BPO companies enjoyed a bump post-COVID, maybe to varying degrees depending on their portfolios and execution. But in response to your question, I think that was a big driver for us post-COVID.
That's really interesting. I never, thought of COVID in terms of the BPO perspective. So now what is the BPO space looking like? Is there some, maybe new trend that you're seeing? What's the next big thing? Is there something like that?
Well, the big trend I think for the industry has been around automation, with whom we have a love-hate relationship.
Right.
Hate because to the extent you can automate something, you eliminate manual effort, and manual effort is what creates BPO work.
Yeah.
So it cannibalizes our portfolio of work. But love because automation also creates opportunities. So all these new tools create huge data sets, and therefore to the extent you can derive value from those data, from those pieces of data, and create new services, there is new revenue to be had. That trend is just accelerating, and with this whole trend around artificial intelligence, I think how it unfolds and what it means for the industry remains to be seen. Clearly there is apprehension that the contact center space, the call center space, will be the first to get disrupted, both for voice and chat, because all of these Gen AI tools theoretically over time should become pretty good at executing those customer interactions in an autonomous fashion. So that space might be more vulnerable, but I think the other parts which are more domain oriented, which are less rules based, which don't necessarily have the same scale, and therefore automation is harder to apply, those may be more resilient. But I think automation, artificial intelligence, and its effect on BPO will be the space to watch for the next few years.
Got it. So you gave an example of call centers that might be replaced with Gen AI very soon, because even I've seen startups that focus on this exact space. They're automating customer calls and everything. What are some examples of things that are resilient in BPO today?
I'll give you an example from the work that we do. So, we have a reasonably large size business in financial services, where we work with the large global investment banks doing middle and back office work for their capital markets businesses. So what I mean by that is they may be trading equity or bonds or whatever it is. So a trader sitting in New York or London will do the trade, but all the post-trade work would be done by teams in India with us. So confirming the trade, settling the trade, exchanging securities, exchanging cash, managing risk and P&L, and so on and so forth. So in those types of functions, a lot of automation has already been brought to bear. So if you think about trading on the NSE today, it's largely automated, right? You put an order in your app, it goes through, and everything happens without any human interface, which is true also to a large degree in the West. But so our teams are now basically doing exception handling. So where the automated systems fail is where our teams step in to see why did that trade fail, how does it have to be resolved, and so on and so forth. So those types of functions I think are more resilient because every situation is different. It's not as rules based. We don't have the same degree of scale. You don't have like 50 people doing the same job. You have 3 people in one team. So the cost benefit on building some piece of automation is just not there in many of those instances. So I think work that is more complex, work that is small teams, work where rules keep changing because of market structure, regulation, whatever it is, those things are typically harder to automate.
That's interesting. Okay. One more thing was that you got clients and then you, I think, hired some freelancers or people on contract to do the work for the initial clients, and then later on you got people full time. But today you see a very different thing where people raise funding, build product for a lot of time before even going to market, right? So what are your thoughts on that? Would you do it that way today?
Well, I think it's very different contexts because in a services business, which is what we are, it's a very linear business, which I would say is lower risk and lower reward. Because you're working for clients, your upside is capped, you get an hourly rate from the client for the work you do, and you basically make a margin between that rate and what your labor cost is. The product business I would characterize more as a lottery ticket business. So you're building products, there is a small success rate on that, but the guys who win will win big, right? And there is no way to test what you're doing until you at least build a minimum viable product.
Yeah.
So there has to be some degree of upfront investment that goes in, which is well before any hope of any revenue coming through the door. So in that model, I think there is no alternative to raising capital upfront and investing in the product. The degree of risk you want to take is up to you, but I think that the dynamics of that business make it imperative to raise capital upfront. In a services business, I think you can bootstrap.
Right. So since you brought out the contrast between product and service businesses, one interesting thing is eClerx advertises on the website as productized services. And today again you mentioned one interesting thing between picking between scale and skill, right? So if you could elaborate on how that was a big decision for you.
Sure. So when we started, as you mentioned, we had a choice of either trying to compete on the basis of scale, as in being the lowest cost in our area and having masses of people, or on skill, by which I mean specialization. And we felt that as a small startup, we really couldn't compete on scale, so we chose to go with skill. The next decision was around picking the areas where we wanted to focus in. So we picked areas where either my business partner or I had some degree of domain expertise, where we thought we could be credible in terms of differentiating ourselves. And once you do that, you shape your demand and your portfolio of work to be more in your areas of strength, where you think you have a right to play and more of a legitimate right to win. The other thing we try to do is obviously over time build some proprietary intellectual property within the firm around those service portfolios. So if you're doing this capital markets work that I referenced a few minutes ago, building some technology tools, that make that process more efficient, that reduce the possibility of errors. And we could afford to do it because we were doing similar work for multiple banks. Any one bank on its own probably may not have wanted to invest in that technology. So once you do those things, then you have a long history of working in that space. You have some marquee referenceable clients who come from that space. You have something different that you're doing because you built custom built technology for that function which nobody else has, and therefore your chances of success are much higher. I think that's what productized service to us means.
Got it. And so as I started out, 18,000 people globally, what would you do to maybe have entrepreneurs within eClerx?
That's a great question. So there are different things we do with varying degrees of success. I would say on the whole, the firm is a very entrepreneurial place to be. And, I've heard people say that we give responsibility to new managers much earlier in their career with us than perhaps they might get, let's say, with the Infosys or TCS. And that's one of the benefits you have of being a small firm, that you can afford to do that. And we encourage people to take decisions and ask for forgiveness later, as opposed to, asking for permission and waiting in line for a long time. So I would say, broadly speaking, that culture is there. We've done more formal things as well within the firm, where we've run programs where we encourage people to come up with ideas, and the firm would back them with funding and would make available certain resources, whether it's infrastructure or technology skills or whatever it is that they might need for their idea. So we've done that in a couple of instances as well. But I think those are the good examples.
Yeah, that's interesting. The culture thing I found pretty nice, where you're telling people to take decisions and then see what happens. Is there any other thing you felt that you did culturally within your organization that worked out really well?
I think just trying to be very data driven in terms of decisions you're making, including how you're evaluating people at year end. So we tried to create more scientific rigor and expertise around that, so it becomes less about personal choice and personalities and much more about objective metrics that can be measured. And therefore you become more meritocratic as a result. And I think that's very important, because in our industry, the quality of talent you have is a big determinant of the success or failure of the firm. So to the extent you create a culture where you attract and retain the best, and they feel they have a fair shot at success, that's helpful.
Yeah, coming to today, we're at Laksha, which is trying to do something different here, trying to give everyone the entrepreneurial thinking, even if they don't want to become an entrepreneur at the end of the day. So what advice would you give to college students here who maybe want to do something in that field?
Well, I would say 2-3 things. When I look back in hindsight, my 2 years at Wharton were probably among the best years of my life, and I have no doubt that for a vast majority of students here at Plaksha, the 4 years that you spend here, you will always look back very fondly with. So first of all, in the midst of all the pressures that are on you, both academic and otherwise, please enjoy the 4 years that you have. You will look back on this very fondly. Secondly, as you may have heard me speak, the connections and friendships I forged at Wharton were an integral part of the business that exists today. And again, I would think the same thing is true for those of you who want to be entrepreneurs at Plaksha, because the people around you in your batch or the year above will all go on to do interesting things in life, and some of them may be doing things that can be helpful to you in your journey. So do spend that time to make the connections and meet people here and build relationships, because ultimately life is about relationships and business is about people wanting to work with other people. And thirdly, I would say, the India of today is a very exciting place to be, and the ecosystem that exists to support entrepreneurship is more vibrant than it has ever been, at least in my career over the last 25 years. Availability of funding, resources, risk-taking appetite, knowledge, all of that is available to people in a different order of magnitude than perhaps even 10 or 15 years ago. So I think you all are in a great institution, working with great colleagues, and you will emerge into an India that's very fertile for new ideas and new businesses. So you should make the most of it. It requires a lot of tenacity and grit, because every business goes through good and bad times, as all entrepreneurs find. But if you do that, then I think your chances of success are pretty decent.
Right. And since we've mentioned the ecosystem here, it's a super interesting place to be with, I think, Antler's report on how new industries are going to emerge, like old age care, and even how the consuming class is increasing, right? So what do you think are some of the next big spaces or exciting spaces to be in?
Well, obviously there is this whole trend around artificial intelligence and AGI and, where that leads. But I would say more broadly also around healthcare and life sciences and around the personalization of medicine. There is so much that is happening, and I think the traditional approaches to medicine are being left behind by some of these new, more radical Silicon Valley type approaches to the life sciences. So I'd say that's another big area of of opportunity. Obviously, energy will continue to be another area of opportunity, particularly around renewables and green energy. So I think it's an exciting time.
Yeah, I agree. Yeah, I think that's about it that I had prepared in terms of questions. Is there anything else you would like to say?
No, I think, just as I mentioned earlier, I do feel that students at Plaksha are very fortunate. It's a great institution. It's probably fairly unique in India, certainly in technical education, in terms of allowing people to pursue these interdisciplinary programs and to have such an experiential learning opportunity here. So, you should make the most of the time here, and all the best for the future.
All right. So thank you so much for being here today. It was an honor to host you on the podcast, and a lot of great insights that I think would be helpful for everyone at Plaksha and even people who might be viewing this from outside Plaksha. Thank you so much.
Thank you for having me. Always a pleasure to visit Plaksha and see everything that's happening here. And the biggest pleasure is in meeting and interacting with students. So thank you. I really enjoyed my time today here.